Chapter 5. Javi gave her the option of where to get a drink. She wanted to be sat on the front, looking out at the sea. As they walked and chatted, Angelica thought about Javi. He was a nice guy. She felt safe around him, but he wasn't ever going to be anything other than a friend. She felt nothing but platonic thoughts about him. The chat was natural. He asked how Tommy was. She asked about his family. He told her almost nothing about them. He mentioned a son. By the way he talked, the son sounded like he was either in adulthood or fast approaching it. She tried to imagine Javi as a father figure. He would be all the things that a son would need, she concluded. As it happened, Angelica fancied a cuppa, a pit stop before the rest of the planned activity of the day. She wasn't always a breakfast person. Before Tommy, she didn't eat it at all. But when he was born, she felt that she should be setting a good example. It came to her in many ways of life. She managed her fear of spiders so she didn't pass it on to him. She wore sunscreen for the first time in her life. And in terms of food, she moved from grazing whenever she felt hungry throughout the day to 3 square meals as soon as he was weaned. These felt like the right things to do. Angelica picked her favourite cafe, Nere. Not quite the same as you would get back in the UK, but a place that did a wicked cup of coffee, strong, full of flavour, and with a kick that would keep her going for hours before the caffeine crash later. Angelica had read that you should either drink coffee at the same time every single day or not at all. The body got into a cycle linked to the way the caffeine ebbed and flowed in the system. She wasn't that regular a drinker of the stuff. She knew that it would give her a high, followed by a low and then a craving at about the same time the next day. And she was prepared for that. "What do you want?" Javi asked. "Latte," she replied, not really knowing that much about coffee. Certainly not as much as a aficionado, that was for sure. She sat at the table. Javi went inside to order. Mostly you waited for someone from the cafe to come out and take your order, but Javi didn't seem to follow this convention, rushing into the cafe as soon as Angelica took her seat. Maybe he wanted to ensure that he paid, not entering into a conversation about who would get the bill at the end. Angelica saw him place a €10 bill on the counter and walk back out to the table near the sea wall. The tide was coming in at some rate. The sea splashed against the rocks below, sending spray up the side of the wall and into the air. The finest of sprays reached the promenade, refreshing people out for a walk in the morning sun that was starting to heat the area up to the mid-20s. He sat next to her, arching his body so they were eye to eye. She was more than comfortable with Javi. His manner was slightly awkward, but in a way that made you feel at home with him. Some people hide their discomfort deep below, putting out a sterile version of their inner self to the world. Javi was comfortable enough in his inner self to let all the quirks out. Angelica respected that. "How's business?" she asked in a vain attempt to ignite some conversation that might lead to her involvement in a murder investigation. She knew it was a long shot, but she enjoyed working with Javi and her brother Augustine the year before. Augustine was a murder detective himself, back in the UK. "It's really quiet. Things ramp up in the summer when the tourists arrive. We don't have many murders here in Javier. We're not a big city like Valencia or a den of iniquity like Benidorm, you know." He smirked. "It's one of the reasons I feel safe here," she responded, not letting on that he was the other reason she felt safe in Javier. Her hug might have given away that he was someone she felt safe around, but she wasn't going to verbalize it. The coffees arrived. She spotted that he'd chosen a cafe solo, the Spanish equivalent of an Italian espresso. It always struck her as a drink that people quaffed as a pure caffeine hit rather than anything to linger over. Javi looked at the coffee on the table, looked up at the waiter, and smiled. He enjoyed nothing more than a cafe solo in mid-morning, especially when he'd had an early start. Javi's narrow features squinted in the sunlight. He reached in his pocket for a pair of sunglasses. His outfit was always the same when the weather allowed. Khaki shorts and a sleeveless khaki jacket over a white t-shirt. He wore hiking boots, ready to get moving when the moment presented itself. His beard always looked unkempt. Angelica couldn't work out whether that was his style or if he just didn't pay much attention to it. She thanked the waiter, and then thanked Javi for the coffee. He nodded in return. "And you think you might stay in Javier for a while at least?" Javi asked awkwardly. He didn't know how to ask the question. Something inside him wanted her to stick around. Like Angelica, he didn't have romantic feelings for her, but felt himself in her company. "I can't see any reason to leave," she replied, just as the buzzing sound from his phone started. He looked around, found a spot where he could be on his own, and stepped away from the table. She listened as much as she could to his phone conversation. There were only the odd words she could pick up against the background of chatter from other people, the waves splashing against the rocks, and the hum of the air conditioning units on the roofs of the cafes. "Murder. Immediately. No help. Pain." There was a word that she couldn't quite put her finger on near the end of his conversation. She mulled it over in her head, but couldn't form it fully. Whatever it was, Angelica knew it would come to her later. "I have to go," Javi Jones said, reaching over and downing his cafe solo without getting back into his seat. "I'm sorry, but duty calls." She smiled back in his direction. She knew that his job meant he couldn't brush off work for a coffee with a friend. "Hopefully we'll see each other soon," she said with anticipation. As soon as the words came out of her mouth, she regretted it. The words sounded desperate, and that wasn't Angelica. He nodded in reply, smiling a bigger smile. Maybe it wasn't desperate. As Javi Jones walked off, the word that she had heard came to Angelica. Gonzalez.